Hello, economics students. So in our discussion today, we're moving on to chapter 21, which is on unemployment. Now, this is a sadly very topical thing for us to be dealing with right now. I'm sure you've seen in the midst of the COVID shutdown that we've had horrific rises in unemployment. I believe last week, more than 4 million people were first-time filers for unemployment insurance claims. And that came after 2 earlier weeks of really nasty rises in unemployment. And this is certainly going to be a fact of life for quite some time. Even as states technically are opening up, I mean, how many employees does a restaurant need, which is limited to 1/4 of its normal size? The economy is going to be very slow to bounce back from this shutdown, I fear. Consumers aren't going to want to get out in the same numbers and go to crowded places and do the same things they did for quite some time. And so unemployment is going to be a fact of life as you're finishing your high school educations, I hate to say. So you need to know about this question. First off, what does it mean to talk about unemployment? Now, that may seem like an obvious answer, but in fact, it's quite complicated. First off, we need to know what the workforce is. And that's what comes up in 21.1 in your books, where it starts trying to define the workforce. So the first thing you want to do is start with all Americans, citizens, non-citizens, everybody living in the country, 16 years old or older. So that's who they start looking at. Probably all of you in the class, or almost everybody in the class, is 16 or older. But does that mean you're part of the workforce yet? No, not necessarily. Because you start off looking at that pool, Americans 16 and older. But you're automatically going to take out people who are not interested in employment for pay. So, you're automatically limited everybody under 16. But if you have not decided to start looking for a job yet, you don't qualify as part of the workforce. Or if you're retired. If you're retired and don't plan on looking for gainful employment now, you aren't part of the workforce either. So many times students, college students, focusing on their studies, aren't working. But also, you'll have people who choose not to work. Stay-at-home wives and dads, and moms and dads, staying home with the kids. The spouse may have a job to support the family, but they're full-time homemakers for a time, raising children and tending the home for no pay. Now, this doesn't mean those aren't tough jobs. I'm sure they are. And certainly the housewife or the house husband who, labors away in washing clothes and vacuuming and ironing and then on top of that, taking care of small kids who might be at home. Of course, that's a tough job. But if you're not paid to do it, you're not in the workforce doing that job. And that is a question, For many, many years, those jobs are overwhelmingly done by women at home for no pay. And the question is, shouldn't we count that? That's human labor that if you had to pay for all that, what if you had to pay somebody to come in and wash your clothes and mop your floors and vacuum your house? I'm betting you'd have to pay them maybe hundreds of dollars a day to do that, right? Not to mention childcare expenses, which are thrown in yet again. So these stay-at-home folks are doing serious work in the economy, but they don't get paid, so they're not part of the labor force. Similarly, if you are chronically ill or injured and can't hold down gainful employment, you're not part of the labor force. If you have not been actively looking for a job, you are also not considered part of the labor force. Now, this is going to cause a problem. We'll talk about this later, but just to foreground it for you, you have to either have a job or be actively looking for a job to be considered part of the labor force. Let's say, though, you had a good job and you lost that job. You got laid off in a recession or something. And for months, you did actively look for a job. But after 5, 6 months of trying hard to find decent work and you couldn't find it, you just gave up. These are what are called discouraged workers. And if you have given up actively looking, you're not part of the labor force. This could also tie in with what we were talking about, the poverty trap before. There are government programs to help the very poor in the United States. But if you are, hold on just a second. Pop, I don't know what you're up to, but that's very loud. Okay. So if you are very poor, you can get government assistance. But it might be that the government assistance is better than the minimum wage job you could get to work. So you might think it's just better to rely on the federal aid than to get whatever job you can get for minimum wage. So that's how you wind up with discouraged workers. They fall out of the labor force if you do that. Okay, so the labor force is all those people 16 and older who either have gainful employment or are actively looking for gainful employment. All right, so you may not have a job, but if you're looking, you're part of the labor force. Everybody else is out of the labor force. Retirees, small children, people who voluntarily to focus on school or stay home with the family, or who are too sick or are injured to hold gainful employment, they are out of the labor force. The numbers for the United States, I think in the second edition, the most recent number was over 159 million. So there are 160 million, give or take, Americans who are in the labor force. The unemployment rate is, unsurprisingly, the number of people who are in the labor force but are not presently employed, divided by the total number of people in the labor force, and then multiplied by 100 gives you the percentage. Okay? So that's easy enough. It's the portion of the labor force that does not presently have gainful employment. In your textbook, you'll no doubt have a pie chart in 21.1 that points out that a surprisingly large, it might be surprising to you, it was surprising to me the first time I saw it, a surprisingly large number of people 16 and older in our country are out of the labor force. Even in bad times, bad economic times, the number of unemployed is actually a pretty small percentage of Americans because most people are employed. I mean, even in the depths of the Great Recession, we didn't get over 12% unemployment. And that means that, 88% of people in the labor force did have jobs for pay. But also something on the order of 40% of Americans are out of the labor force. Of 16 years old and older Americans, adult Americans, are out of the labor force entirely. Okay, so questions. Hidden unemployment. It talks about hidden unemployment. Now, part of that I've already talked about, the discouraged worker, the person who gave up on looking for a job. And they're just sitting on the couch, drawing some kind of maybe assistance from the government, or maybe just relying on relatives to take care of them, but they've just given up. There is another kind of thing that is often lumped in with hidden unemployment. It's not technically unemployment, it's underemployment. It's you do have an income coming in of some kind, but it is very much below what would be expected of someone with your education and experience. So I spent a lot of years in school, graduate degrees, law degree, been a priest, been a teacher for decades. If I lost all those jobs and the only thing I could come up with would be a dishwasher in a restaurant. There's not to diss people who work as dishwashers. We need them to have restaurants operate. But if the only job I could find was as a dishwasher in a restaurant, I would be paid something. I would not be unemployed, right? I would get a check from the restaurant, but it is almost certainly far less than I would earn in my jobs as a preacher and as a teacher and so on, so that I would certainly be underemployed. As a dishwasher, somebody with my training and experience would be underemployed as a dishwasher. So that's often put in with hidden unemployment because it doesn't appear in the figures. I would be an employee. I would have a salary coming in, so I'm not unemployed. But the job pays a great deal less than you would think someone like me would earn. And I'm probably not very happy, frankly. I want something other than dishwashing if I'm doing that, right? And this is frequently a problem in economic downturns. You can have highly skilled people who lose good paying jobs, and they, out of desperation, when they can't find something in their field, something like what they lost, have to take something to put food on the table. Well, they suddenly disappear from the unemployment figures when that happens. But it's hardly a thriving situation. This is a little bit of what, after the Great Recession, there were lots of highly talented, highly educated, very well experienced people who wound up taking jobs in the gig economy, driving for Uber or something, engineers driving for Uber because they couldn't find an engineering job. That would be underemployment, and it's hidden because they don't have the kind of job they really want, but they don't qualify as unemployed technically. All right. A crucial figure is the labor force participation rate. This is the percentage of adults in an economy who are either employed or are unemployed and looking for a job. So that, as I said, is something on the order of 60% of Americans over the 16 and older. That's the labor force participation rate. Now, your book will point out there that that rate reached its height in late 1999. In late 1999, that was the highest percentage. 68% of Americans were employed for money. And that's the highest it has ever been. Now, part of the reason why is until the 1950s and 60s, relatively few American women were employed for money outside the home. They were mostly homemakers. But as women began to take more and more of a part in the economy, especially in the 70s and 80s, that's what causes the labor force participation rate in the United States to start shooting up. More and more women seeking gainful employment, not just full-time homemakers. Well, that didn't mean to say it sounds not full-time homemakers, but probably doing the homemaking and having a gainful job outside the home. That's what spikes it up. It reaches its peak in the late 90s. But it has actually ticked down since. And there are many reasons for that. And it's steadily declined, and it especially declined after the Great Recession. Now, why? Now, if you're unemployed, you're still part of the labor force, right? As long as you're still looking for a job, if you don't become a discouraged worker, you're unemployed. But what about what a lot of people did is when they lost their old jobs, they went to school. And they might have decided, I need to get new training. My old job as a coal miner is never coming back. I need a new set of skills to get a decent job in some other industry. So this has been a lot of the decline in the labor force participation rate since 1999. People seeing technologies advancing rapidly, realizing that probably is the way of the future for a lot of jobs. I need more training. I need an MBA with an emphasis in information systems. Whatever. I'm going to give up my job doing X and go to nursing school. A lot of people have done that. So that's why you see labor force participation rates the last 20 years actually declining from their height in 1999. The couple of ways in which the government gets information about employment, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, one of them is the Establishment Payroll Survey. This is the first sort of quick snapshot. And the kind of news like I saw this morning about, unemployment rates That comes from a quick survey done of the businesses in America to see how many people they have on their payroll. Is it higher now than it was last week? Is it lower than it was last week? So they can get a fairly quick understanding of that from looking at 140,000 businesses around the United States. Quick phone call. So that's the quick snapshot that they look at in Washington to try to get a feeling on unemployment. But below that, you'll see the U.S. unemployment data collection. And it's actually a very elaborate kind of census type undertaking where the country is divided up, and it runs through it 3,137 areas. And they break that down into 729 to survey. And then they select families within that, and they follow that family for 4 months in a row. And they try to make sure that these areas and the people, the demographics of the people in them, match the demographics of the United States. So this is how they can kind of bore down and get more detailed data by these following very carefully those things. All right, so that's our first discussion on unemployment. We got probably 2 more to go. So I'll see you next week. God bless.